So I'm going to take my thumb and put it on the bottom of my rib cage here. I can kind of feel that bottom rib. And then I'll take my index finger and put it on the top of my pelvis. I'm going to bend to one side like this. And look at how close together my fingers came. The midsection can squash down further than we think, but because we don't want to draw it that way, because we draw the midsection too big, especially when the pose is bent to one side, it ends up being that the whole torso becomes elongated. And a long torso, often for that reason, because the midsection is too big, is a classic proportion issue. And that is the kind of thing that we're going to cover in this video. And you can check if you're doing these things and if it's impacting your drawings, and then you can fix it and your drawings will instantly get better. My name's Kenzo and this is Love Life Drawing. It's something that I used to do all the time. So here are some of my old drawings as a beginner. I used to elongate the torso so often this way and I didn't realize it at all. Here's another example from a student from our course. So you can see at this stage, Mark already had a lot of fantastic skill in his drawings. So he's simplifying really well and he's capturing these dynamic angles in the pose really nicely. It's just that the midsection hasn't been allowed to squash. It's too long. So look at the difference if we just cut the midsection down, bring the pelvis up closer to the rib cage. So for me, as time went on and I kept practicing, these issues started to reduce because I worked on them. And so for me now, proportions aren't a big concern, even in a quick sketch when there's no time for measuring. And I think you'll find that proportion problems are a big concern early in your life drawing journey, but eventually proportions are going to become fairly easy, and instead you're going to be concerned with other struggles like anatomy and gesture and design. Okay, so this one has a huge impact if it affects you, shrinking the figure as you go down the figure. I've had struggles with this and it's super common in beginner drawings and intermediate level drawings as well. So there's an enlarged head and then a smaller pelvis and sometimes also small legs. So in other words, the figure is shrinking as you go down. So here, both David on the left and Iola on the right did beautiful drawings, really lovely mark making. They did really good work. They just had a few little proportion issues. The heads are a little large relative to the rib cage, and the pelvis is a little small relative to the rib cage. I took like 1 minute just to shift a few little proportion issues. There was hardly anything to do on these drawings because they had done all the hard work already. Just shrink the head, enlarge the hips and pelvis, and that was basically it. So I'm going to mess up the proportions to the same extent on both drawings, but in one, I'm going to have it so that the head is a little bit small and the legs a little bit long. And in the other one, I'm going to make the head a little big and the legs a little bit short. And it's going to show that this one works a lot better than this one, even though it's equally wrong. And so the point is, you don't have to be accurate. You don't have to be exactly right. There's a lot of leeway when it comes to proportion errors, as long as you make those mistakes in the right direction. So probably better to have the head a little bit small, the legs just a little bit long, rather than the other way round. So for this one, I need to bring my foot up, and I'm not very flexible, so bear with me guys, but this is my foot, and that is my forearm. Similar length. I don't have big feet. This is my hand and that's my forearm. Hand is slightly shorter, but it's a comparable length. It's not way shorter at all. Here's my hand on my face. From my chin all the way up my forehead. Hands and feet are not these little things attached to our long limbs, you know, to the legs are long and then there's these little feet on the end, and our arms are long and then there's these little hands on the end. No, the hands are massive and the feet are massive. We tend to think of them as way smaller than they really are. And yet 75% of the drawings, I'd say, that I look over from students, which often have good proportions elsewhere, have the hands and feet too small, often way too small. And it's not just beginners, but also intermediate artists too. So the other super simple adjustment that I made to these drawings was just to very crudely enlarge the hands. And by the way, this is another area where you don't really have to be perfect, but just go the other way. So a little bit too big rather than a little bit too small, a little bit long rather than too short. On these drawings, I also had the hands and feet too small on this one, which doesn't really work, and too large on this one, where it works out okay. So this is an interesting one. Shoulders that kind of stick out off the torso a little bit too much. So here are two drawings, one by Barbara and one by Mary, and these were kind of drawn as an initial assessment before they started our 2020 course. You can see the shoulders are sticking out in a slightly awkward way. So the issue here is less about proportions and more about structural understanding. So the deltoid muscle on the shoulder is really big, and it's not that people are drawing the deltoid too big, probably drawing it too small actually, but it just looks like the shoulders are sticking out too far, because it's very common to think of the shoulder as something on the side of the torso. So instead, you got to think about the shoulder as starting from right here, right from the middle of your collarbones, the middle of the top of the torso. When I pivot up my shoulder, it's pivoting up from here. When I bring my shoulder forward, it pivots around from here. And then the deltoid muscle, the attachment of it starts deep in on the collarbone, maybe a third of the way in on the collarbone, and it stretches pretty far down the upper arm bone. So it's pretty big. It's just that it's not stuck out on the side like this. It's deeply integrated into the torso and into the upper arm. And so when you can start to understand that structure of the shoulder, you're going to start to draw the deltoid nice and big, but not sticking out on the side so much. And by the way, check this out. So during the course, Mary and Barbara worked really hard. Mary went from this to working on her simplified framework of the figure that we learn what to look for in the figure, how to simplify it. And then eventually she became able to draw difficult figures more confidently without any guidance or support. And that's because she worked really hard on just the few major things that make a big difference. And then Barbara went from this to this, also working on her simplified framework for the figure. She kept practicing really hard during the 6 weeks, getting better and better and understanding and simplifying the figure structure. It's incredible progress, and she even started to tackle quick sketches with her own take on them by the end. Mary and Barbara and everyone on the 2020 course, they worked so hard to improve their skills, and hopefully their results show you what is possible when you focus on the things that really, really matter. And their results actually really gave me a lot of confidence in our 2020 course. I think it's really powerful. So if you want to find out when we're going to run it again, and you also want to get our free guide, Life Drawing Success, and find out when we're doing our live sessions, our free live sessions, sign up to our newsletter. There's a link in the description below. So for some reason, we tend to think of the chest as being quite high up on the torso. I remember I always used to think that the torso was the chest, and then below that, a little gap, and then below that, the ribcage arch, and then below that, the abs. So here you can kind of see my confusion there. And so, for example, you can also see Mary in her pre-course drawing had this model's breasts high on the ribcage, and I see more student drawings with the breasts up high like this than down at the right level. So here's what you need to know. The abs start right under the chest. The chest comes down to about the level of the top of the ribcage arch, and then the abs start around that level too. There isn't this gap there. And then from here, the chest even slopes down further. And then on women, the breasts will often then hang lower still, unless the arms are raised or the person's lying down, in which case they might lie a little bit differently. But the point is that you need to look for how the breasts or the chest comes down further than you might think. And then finally, this one is super interesting. So we all know that foreshortening is tricky at first. We don't want to draw something that our brain knows is long, like a limb. We don't want to draw it short. But from certain angles, the shape that we see is going to be shortened. And so to deal with that, our brain will either elongate that foreshortened limb, like undo the foreshortening, or we'll make it short, but then just shrink the whole thing. So here's the key. Foreshortening doesn't mean shrinking. The limb is still the same volume, it's still the same mass. It's just that from that point of view, it's a bit shorter. We've got to retain the mass, the volume of it. So you still want to capture that mass with your lines around that foreshortened form. You don't shrink the whole thing with foreshortening. You keep the volume, you just make it shorter. For this video, I had to dig out drawings from like 5 years ago, from under my bed that I haven't looked at for ages. And I knew I'd improved in the last few years, but seeing how different those drawings were, it was incredibly powerful. And the way that transformation happened was pretty slow and incremental. And a big part of it was assessing myself and thinking, what am I doing wrong? And how can I overcome that and improve that? So maybe you're consistently making some of those 7 proportion mistakes, or maybe yours are slightly different. But if you can find them and start to work through them, that's a big part of how improvement happens. Guys, we're gonna get good at drawing. There should be another video up on the screen. Check it out, and I'll see you over there.